Sometimes a man reaches a point where he's got nothing left to lose except his dignity. That's where Silas Boone was when he limped into Junk Lake with his old dog and a heart full of regret. Folks called the place worthless, rotting shacks, rusted barrels, and broken dreams scattered along the muddy shore. They laughed when Silas set up camp there, but he wasn't looking for their approval. Every morning, he and his dog Rust walked that forgotten shoreline, picking through trash most people wouldn't touch. Then one day, Rust dug up a corroded iron box behind a sunken boat. Inside was $2 million in stolen gold from an old bank heist. When word spread, dangerous men showed up wanting what Silas found. Would he run again or finally stand his ground? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist rose off Junk Lake like the breath of something dying. Silas Boone stood at the edge of the water, his tin cup steaming in the cold air, and watched the sun try to break through the grey. It never quite made it, not fully. The light here was always filtered, dimmed by the weight of what this place had become, a graveyard for things people wanted to forget. The lake itself wasn't large, maybe half a mile across at its widest point, but it held more wreckage than water. Old rowboats listed in the shallows, their hulls split open like gutted fish. Rusted barrels floated near the far shore, some half submerged, others bobbing lazy in the current. There were remnants of docks that had rotted down to their pilings, and the skeletal frames of shanties that had collapsed under their own neglect. The whole place smelled of decay, wet wood, algae, and something metallic that might have been old blood or just the taste of disappointment. Silas had been here 6 weeks now. 6 weeks since he'd packed what little he owned onto the back of a borrowed mule and walked away from the last town that didn't want him. 6 weeks since he'd decided that if he was going to fade away, he might as well do it somewhere nobody would notice. He took a sip of his coffee. It was bitter and strong the way he liked it. The way Martha used to make it, back when there was still a Martha to make coffee for him. Back when he was still the kind of man worth making coffee for. His knee ached. It always ached these days, ever since that Minier ball had shattered his kneecap at Shiloh. 23 years ago now, but the pain was as fresh as the memory. Some wounds don't heal, they just learn to live inside you, waiting for cold mornings and damp air to remind you they're still there. Rust lay near the fire, his grey muzzle resting on his paws. The dog was old, maybe 12 or 13. Silas had found him half-starved outside a trading post in Colorado, ribs showing, eyes dull with resignation. They'd recognized something in each other that day, two creatures the world had finished with. That was 4 years back, and they'd been together ever since. Rust didn't ask questions, didn't judge, didn't expect anything except a bit of food and a place by the fire. It was the most honest relationship Silas had known in years. The shanty Silas called home sat 20 yards back from the waterline. It had been abandoned when he arrived, one wall caved in, the roof sagging like a broken back. But the frame was solid, and Silas knew how to work with his hands. He'd patched the wall with salvaged planks, reinforced the roof beams, and replaced enough shingles to keep the rain out. Inside, he kept things orderly. His bedroll in one corner, his few cooking implements hung on nails, his spare shirt folded neat on a wooden crate. He'd learned in the war that discipline was the only thing standing between a man and chaos. Even now, especially now, he held to that. The town of Crescent Ridge sat 3 miles east, nestled in a valley where the land flattened out enough for farming. It was a small place, maybe 200 souls, the kind of town where everybody knew everybody else's business and strangers were noticed immediately. Silas went there once a week for supplies, cornmeal, coffee, salt, maybe a bit of salted pork if he had the coin. He kept his head down, spoke only when spoken to, paid for what he needed, and left. The townsfolk watched him, with that particular mix of suspicion and pity reserved for drifters and men who'd lost their way. He'd heard the whispers. Mountain man, hermit, that fellow living out by Junk Lake. None of it bothered him. He'd been called worse. Sheriff Wade Calloway was the law in Crescent Ridge, and he wore the responsibility like a heavy coat. He was younger than Silas by maybe 10 years, broad-shouldered and square-jawed, with eyes that missed nothing. Fair but stern, the kind of lawman who believed in order above all else. He'd stopped by Silas's camp twice in the first few weeks, ostensibly to make sure everything was above board, but really to size up the newcomer. Silas had answered his questions. Yes, he was alone. No, he wasn't causing trouble. Yes, he'd move on when the time came. Calloway had nodded, warned him about campfires in dry weather, and ridden off. But Silas had seen the calculation in the man's eyes. Calloway was the type who kept lists in his head, people to watch, people to worry about. Silas suspected he was on one of those lists. Ezra Finch ran the general store in Crescent Ridge. He was an older man, lean and weathered, with white hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from driftwood. Unlike most of the townsfolk, Ezra treated Silas with a basic human decency that felt almost foreign. He didn't pry, didn't gossip, just filled Silas's order and accepted his payment without commentary. Once when Silas had come up short on coin, Ezra had extended him credit without being asked. "Pay when you can," he'd said, waving off Silas's protest. It was a small kindness, but it had lodged itself in Silas's chest like a splinter. There were others, of course. Old Widow Hennessy, who ran the boarding house and looked at Silas like he was some kind of ghost. Young Tom Pritchard, who worked at the livery and stared at Silas's limp with open curiosity. The Reverend Marcus Fell, who'd invited Silas to Sunday service exactly once, and never again after Silas declined. They were good people, most of them, just not his people. Silas finished his coffee and set the cup down on a flat stone. Russ lifted his head, sensing the routine. Time for their morning walk. They moved along the shoreline, Silas's limp pronounced in the uneven ground, Rust padding ahead with his nose down. This was their ritual. Every morning, same path, same slow circuit around the lake. Silas told himself it was for exercise, to keep his knee from stiffening up completely. But the truth was, he didn't know what else to do with himself. The walking gave him purpose, even if it was a purpose nobody else would understand. The debris field was thickest on the western shore. This was where people had dumped things they didn't want. Broken furniture, cracked pottery, tools too rusted to use. Silas picked through it sometimes, not looking for anything in particular, just occupying his hands. He'd found a tin plate once, dented but serviceable. A length of rope, frayed but still strong enough for tying down a tarp. Small things, useful things. In his bedroll, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden at the bottom of his pack, was a medal, silver tarnished now, with a ribbon that had faded from blue to grey. He'd earned it at Antietam, for holding a position when everyone else had fallen back. They'd pinned it on him at a ceremony he barely remembered, shook his hand, called him a hero. He'd believed them for a while. Believed he was something more than just a man who'd survived when better men hadn't. Martha had been proud of that medal. She'd wanted him to display it, to tell people about it. But Silas had put it away after she died, buried it with the rest of the things he couldn't bear to look at. Heroism was a young man's game. He was 52 years old now, and he'd learned that surviving wasn't the same as winning. Sometimes it was just a slower way of losing. He thought about Martha most mornings. Couldn't help it. She'd been his center, the one fixed point in a world that kept shifting under his feet. They'd met in Tennessee after the war, when he was still trying to figure out who he was now that the fighting was done. She'd worked at a boarding house, had a laugh that could light up a room, and a way of looking at him that made him feel like maybe he wasn't completely broken. They'd had 7 years together. 7 good years in a cabin outside Knoxville, where Silas worked as a sawyer, and Martha kept a garden, and they talked about children they never quite got around to having. Then the fever came through, quick and merciless, and she was gone in 4 days. He'd buried her on a hillside overlooking the valley, planted a dogwood tree over her grave, and walked away. That was 15 years ago. He'd been walking ever since. His knee throbbed as he climbed over a fallen log. The pain was sharper today, which meant rain was coming. He'd learned to read his body like a weather vane. Some men checked the sky. Silas just waited for his old wounds to speak. Rust had wandered ahead, sniffing at something near a half-collapsed dock. Silas whistled once, low, and the dog looked back. "Come on," Silas called. Nothing there worth finding, but Rust stayed put, his tail starting to wag. He began to dig, his front paws churning through the mud and rotted wood. Silas sighed and limped over. "What did you find, boy?" "Another dead fish." Rust dug deeper, his whole body engaged now. Mud flew up behind him. And then Silas saw it, a glint of something dark and metallic beneath the muck. He knelt down, his knees screaming in protest, and pushed Rust gently aside. "Easy now. Let me see." He dug with his hands, pulling away clumps of wet earth and decayed wood. The object was heavy, solid. As he cleared more dirt away, its shape became clear, a box maybe a foot wide and 8 inches deep, made of iron. Corroded green in places, but intact. There was a lock on the front, rusted shut. Silas sat back on his heels, breathing hard. His heart was doing something odd in his chest, something it hadn't done in a long time. This wasn't just another piece of junk. This was something someone had hidden, something someone had meant to come back for. He looked around, as if expecting to see someone watching from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the lake, the mist, the ruins. He and Rust were alone. Silas wrapped his hands around the box and pulled. It didn't want to come free. He rocked it back and forth, working it loose from the mud's grip. Finally, with a sucking sound, it came up, heavy, maybe 40 pounds. He carried it back to his camp, his knee howling with every step. Rust trotted beside him, proud as if he'd retrieved a prize duck. At the fire, Silas set the box down and studied it. The lock wasn't going to open, not without tools. He'd need a chisel, or maybe just a rock and enough patience. But something stopped him from opening it right away. Once he knew what was inside, things would change. He could feel it, the way you feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain falls. He made himself another cup of coffee and sat looking at the box. The metal was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been. There were markings on the top, worn almost smooth, but he could make out what might have been initials. JTM, or maybe JF. Hard to say. Rust lay down next to the box, his chin resting on the edge, looking up at Silas as if to say, "Well, what now?" "I don't know, boy," Silas murmured. "I honestly don't know." He thought about just burying it again, putting it back where Rust had found it and walking away. He'd spent 6 weeks here trying to become invisible, trying to fade into the landscape like morning fog. Opening this box felt like stepping back into the world, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. But he was also tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being the ghost everyone whispered about. Maybe this was something, maybe it was nothing. But for the first time in a long time, Silas felt a flicker of something that might have been curiosity. He picked up a heavy rock and positioned it over the lock. "Might as well see what you've dragged into our lives," he said to Rust. He brought the rock down hard. The lock held. He hit it again, and again. On the 4th strike, the metal gave way with a sharp crack. Silas set the rock aside and carefully opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow stayed mostly dry, were stacks of bills. Old bills, the kind Silas remembered from before the war. But beneath the paper money, gleaming dull even in the dim light, were gold coins. Dozens of them? Maybe hundreds. Silas's hands started to shake. He picked up one of the coins, turned it over. It was heavy, real, an 1871 double eagle, $20 in gold. He'd seen these before, knew what they were worth. He counted quickly, his mind sharp despite the shock. The paper money was likely worthless now, but the gold was another matter. There had to be at least 100 coins here, maybe more. At $20 each, in gold weight alone, this was worth thousands, maybe more than thousands. And then he saw the piece of paper at the bottom of the box, folded and yellowed. He opened it carefully. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Property of First National Bank, Crescent Ridge. Stolen 14th of August 1873 by J.F. McAllister and Associates. Reward for return or information, Silas read it twice. Then a third time. He looked up at the lake, at the rotting docks and sunken boats, and understood. This wasn't just hidden treasure. This was stolen money from a bank robbery more than 20 years ago. Money that had been missing long enough to become legend, and he'd just found it. Rust whined softly, sensing Silas's tension. Silas reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You've gone and made us interesting, boy. That's the last thing we needed," because Silas knew how these things worked. Word would spread. It always did. You couldn't keep a secret like this, not in a small town, not when that kind of money was involved. People would come, questions would be asked, and Sheriff Calloway would want answers. The smart thing would be to take the box into town, hand it over to the law, maybe collect a finder's fee if one was still being offered. Walk away clean. But Silas looked at the gold coins glinting in his palm, and he thought about the 7 years with Martha, the cabin they'd never quite finished, the children they'd never had, because there was never enough money, never enough security. He thought about 15 years of drifting, of working for scraps, of being nobody going nowhere, and he thought, maybe this is why I came here. Maybe this is what I've been walking toward all along. He closed the box carefully and covered it with his blanket. Then he sat by the fire and waited for the world to find him. The decision to keep quiet lasted exactly 2 days. Silas had convinced himself he could sit on the discovery, at least for a while. He'd hidden the strongbox under the floorboards of his shanty, wrapped in canvas and buried beneath his spare blanket and a pile of firewood. Out of sight, out of mind. Except it wasn't out of mind at all. He thought about it constantly. When he was walking the shoreline, when he was cooking his meals, when he lay awake at night, listening to Rust snore by the dying fire, the gold had weight, and not just physical weight. It pressed on him like a hand on his chest, making it hard to breathe. On the 3rd morning, he woke to find boot prints in the mud outside his shanty. Fresh ones, made sometime in the night while he'd been sleeping. Someone had been here, close enough to touch the walls, close enough to hear him breathing. The prints circled the entire structure, then headed back toward the tree line and disappeared. Silas stood in his doorway, his old army revolver in his hand, and felt the cold certainty settle into his bones. Someone knew. Rust growled low in his throat, his hackles up. The dog was staring at the tree line, his body tense. Whatever scent he'd picked up, it wasn't friendly. He spent the morning checking the perimeter. He found a cigarette butt near the water's edge, hand-rolled, still fresh enough that it hadn't been rained on. Whoever had been watching him was confident enough to stand there smoking while they observed. That afternoon, when Silas went into Crescent Ridge for supplies, the atmosphere had shifted. People who normally ignored him now watched him openly. Conversations stopped when he walked past. Even Ezra Finch seemed nervous when Silas entered the general store. "Afternoon, Silas," Ezra said, his voice carefully neutral. "Ezra," Silas set his list on the counter. "Need the usual." Ezra glanced at the list, then looked up. His eyes held a warning. "Been some talk in town." "Thought you should know." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that brings trouble." Ezra kept his voice low. "Word is you found something out at the lake." "Something valuable." Silas felt his stomach drop. "Where'd you hear that?" "Does it matter?" Ezra began gathering items from the shelves. In a town this size, secrets last about as long as morning dew. "The Driscoll brothers rode in yesterday." "You know them?" Silas shook his head. "Consider yourself fortunate. They're out of Colorado, rough men who work the mining camps. They heard about a big find at Junk Lake and came to investigate." Ezra's expression was grim. "They're not the type to ask politely. I haven't told anyone, didn't need to. Your dog digs up a strongbox in plain sight. Someone's bound to notice. Could have been a trapper passing through. All it takes is one person seeing something unusual." Ezra finished packing the supplies. "My advice, take whatever you found to Sheriff Calloway. Let the law handle it." Silas paid and left without responding. The idea of handing over the gold to Calloway stuck in his throat. It was the right thing to do, but something in him resisted. That money represented a way out, a chance to stop drifting and build something real. He was loading his supplies onto his mule when 3 men stepped out of the saloon across the street. They moved with the easy confidence of people used to getting their way. The one in front was broad and thick-bodied, with a face like hammered leather. His two companions were leaner, meaner looking. All three wore guns on their hips. The broad one crossed the street towards Silas. His smile didn't reach his. "Eyes, you'd be the fellow living out at Junk Lake," he said. "I would be." Silas kept his hands visible. His tone even. "Name's Cole Driscoll. These are my associates, Frank and Little Pete." He gestured to the other two men. "We're interested in doing some prospecting around the lake. Heard there might be opportunity there." "It's public land," Silas said. "No claim on it." "That's what we figured." Cole's smile widened. "We'll be setting up camp nearby. Thought it'd be polite to introduce ourselves first." The threat was subtle but clear. They were coming, and they expected Silas to cooperate. "Lake's already been picked clean," Silas said. "Nothing there but rust and rot." "Maybe so. But we're thorough men. Like to check things for ourselves." Cole glanced at the mule. "You need any help getting back?" Path can be treacherous for a man with a bad leg. The casual mention of his injury felt like a blade being tested against his throat. "I manage fine," Silas said. "I'm sure you do." Cole tipped his hat. "We'll be seeing you around, neighbor." The three men walked away, their laughter carrying back across the street. Silas stood there, feeling the weight of their attention, like a target painted on his back. He rode back to Junk Lake with Russ trotting alongside. He could leave, pack up tonight, and disappear before the Driscolls made their move. He'd done it before, dozens of times. But the thought of running again felt like a stone in his chest. As he crested the ridge overlooking the lake, he saw smoke rising from his camp. Too much smoke. His heart kicked into a gallop. He urged the mule forward. Rust broke into a run ahead of him. When he reached the clearing, his shanty was on fire. Not a raging inferno, but enough that the walls were blackened and flames licked at the roof. Someone had set it deliberately, a warning, not destruction. Silas tied the mule and grabbed his water bucket. He threw water on the flames, working frantically. It took 20 minutes to get the fire under control. By then, half the roof was gone, and the interior was smoke-damaged and ruined. He stood there, chest heaving, and surveyed the damage. They'd done this while he was in town. They'd known exactly when he'd be gone, and then he saw it, a message carved into the one wall that hadn't burned. Crude letters cut deep with a knife. "Share or burn." Silas felt something inside him go cold and hard. This wasn't about the gold anymore. This was about respect, about whether he was still a man worth reckoning with, or just another broken-down drifter who could be pushed around. He went to the floorboards where he'd hidden the strongbox. They were pried up, splintered. His blanket and firewood were scattered. But the box was still there. They hadn't found it. Either they'd run out of time, or the hiding spot had been better than he'd thought. He pulled the box out and opened it. The gold gleamed up at him, unchanged, indifferent to the chaos around it. Rust whined and pressed against his leg. "I know." "Boy," Silas said quietly. He looked at the ruined shanty, at the threatening message carved into the wall, at the gold in his hands. And he made his decision. He wasn't running. He would take the gold to Sheriff Calloway in the morning, let the law sort it out. But tonight he'd stay. He'd rebuild his fire, sleep with his revolver loaded, and make it clear that he wasn't going to be frightened off. He set up a new camp in the clearing, built a fire ring, and arranged his remaining possessions within easy reach. He loaded his revolver, checked the percussion caps, and laid it beside his bedroll. Then he made coffee and sat with his back against a tree, Rust at his side, and waited for nightfall. The Driscolls would come again. He was certain of it. They'd come to see if their warning had worked, to see if he'd broken or fled. And when they did, they'd find out that Silas Boone might be old, might be tired, might be beaten down by life, but he wasn't finished yet. As darkness settled over Junk Lake, Silas sat by his fire and thought about Martha. About the life they'd planned and never got to live. About the man he'd been before the world had worn him down. And he thought about the gold, sitting heavy in its box beside him, and wondered if maybe this was his chance to become that man again, even if only for a little while. They came just after midnight. Silas heard them before he saw them, the soft crunch of boots on gravel, the whisper of branches being pushed aside. 3 shapes moving through the darkness, thinking they were quiet. They weren't quiet enough. He was already awake, his revolver in his hand, Rust pressed close against his side. The dog's body was tense, ready. Silas had one hand on Rust's collar, keeping him still and silent. The three men approached the ruined shanty first. They moved carefully, checking the structure, looking for signs of life. When they found it empty, one of them cursed softly. "He ran," one voice said. "Told you he would." Maybe. That was Cole Driscoll's voice, deeper and more measured. "Or maybe he's smarter than we gave him credit for." "Spread out," Cole ordered. "Check the perimeter." The three men split up, moving in different directions. Silas watched them from his position 30 yards away, behind a fallen log near the tree line. He'd chosen this spot deliberately. Good sight lines, cover, and an escape route through the woods if things went badly. One of the men moved closest to Silas's position. He was carrying a rifle, holding it casual but ready. He paused 10 feet from the log, his head turning as he scanned the darkness. Silas barely breathed. Rust was motionless, understanding somehow that silence was survival. The man took another step closer. Then an owl called out from the trees behind them. He spun toward the sound, startled, and Silas used the moment to press himself flatter against the ground. "Anything?" Cole's voice called from near the water. "Nothing! Just shadows and birds. Check the shore." The man moved away, and Silas let out a slow, silent breath. He waited as the three men searched for another 20 minutes, growing increasingly frustrated. Finally, Cole called them back together near the burned shanty. "He's gone," Frank said. "Probably halfway to the next county by now." "Maybe," Cole said. "Leave the message. Make sure he understands what happens if he doesn't cooperate." One of them produced a piece of paper and a nail. Silas heard the hammering as they affixed it to what remained of his shanty wall. Then the three men disappeared back into the trees, their footsteps fading into the night. Silas stayed in position for another hour, making certain they were truly gone. Only then did he rise, his knees screaming from being held in one position. Russ stood beside him, stretching. They moved quietly to the shanty. In the moonlight, Silas could see the paper nailed to the wall. He pulled it down and carried it back to his fire to read. The handwriting was crude but clear. "Half or everything. Your choice. Noon tomorrow." "Come alone?" Silas crumpled the paper in his fist. They wanted him to bring the gold to them at noon, probably somewhere away from witnesses where they could take it all and dispose of him. It was a simple plan, and it might have worked if Silas had been the frightened old man they thought he was. But that midnight visit had changed something in him. Watching them hunt for him in the darkness had awakened something he'd thought was long dead. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. Something that remembered how to fight. He fed the fire and made coffee as dawn broke over the lake. The gold sat in its box beside him, and he stared at it while he drank. This wasn't even about the money anymore. It was about principle, about drawing a line and saying, "Not one more step." When the sun was fully up, he wrapped the strongbox in canvas and tied it onto his mule. Then he saddled up, whistled for Rust, and headed toward Crescent Ridge. Sheriff Calloway's office was a small building near the center of town. Silas tied up his mule and carried the strongbox inside. Calloway was at his desk, working through paperwork. He looked up when Silas entered, and his expression shifted from surprise to wariness. "Mr. Boone," he said. "Wasn't expecting to see you. Got something needs your attention, Sheriff." Silas set the strongbox on the desk with a heavy thunk. Calloway stared at it, then at Silas. "That what I think it is?" "Depends on what you think it is." Silas opened the lid. "Found it 3 days ago, buried near the shoreline. There's a paper inside says it belongs to the First National Bank, stolen back in 1873. Calloway stood and examined the contents. He picked up one of the gold coins, turned it over, then read the yellowed paper. When he looked up, there was something like respect in his eyes. "This is the McAllister heist money," he said quietly. "I've been missing for over 20 years. "It's real enough," Silas said. "And I'm real enough to bring it in, instead of disappearing with it. But there's men who know I found this. Dangerous men. They burned my shanty yesterday, left me a message saying I needed to share or they'd finish the job. Name's Cole Driscoll and his brothers." Calloway's jaw tightened. "The Driscolls. Should have run them out immediately. They want me to meet them at noon today. Bring the gold, and instead you brought it here. Calloway nodded slowly. That took courage, Mr. Boone. Most men in your position would have just run. I'm tired of running, Sheriff. Silas met his gaze. I've spent 15 years running from ghosts and bad memories. Maybe it's time I stood still for once. Calloway was quiet for a moment, studying Silas. Then he walked to a cabinet and pulled out a deputy's badge. He set it on the desk between them. I could use a man who knows how to stand his ground, he said. Temporary deputy. Just for today. Help me bring the Driscolls in, and there's $50 in it for you. Silas looked at the badge. It was tarnished silver, worn smooth in places from years of use. It reminded him of his war medal, another symbol of duty and honor that came with a price. I'm not a lawman, he said. No, but you were a soldier. I can see it in how you carry yourself. Calloway pushed the badge closer. The Driscolls expect you to show up alone and afraid. What they won't expect is for you to show up as the law. Silas picked up the badge, felt its weight. It was lighter than he'd expected. Lighter than the gold, lighter than his guilt. What's your plan? He asked. Calloway smiled. We give them exactly what they asked for. You show up at noon, alone, but not unarmed, and not without backup they won't see coming. Silas pinned the badge to his shirt. It sat there over his heart, strange and familiar all at once. Then I guess I'm your deputy, Sheriff, he said. At least for today. Rust, who'd been lying patiently by the door, lifted his head and thumped his tail once against the floor. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, and somewhere near Junk Lake, 3 men waited for prey that was about to become predator. Calloway spread a hand-drawn map across his desk. It showed Junk Lake, the surrounding terrain, and several X marks indicating positions. The Driscolls will want to meet somewhere they control, he said, tapping the map. Probably here, on the North Shore. There's a clearing with good sightlines, hard to approach without being seen. Perfect for an ambush. Silas studied the map. You know the area well. Grew up hunting these woods. My father taught me every ridge and hollow. Calloway marked 3 more positions on the map. If I'm right about where they'll set up, we can position men here, here, and here. They'll be watching for you to approach from the main trail. Won't think to look behind them. How many men can you gather? Silas asked. 3 I trust completely. Ezra Finch, believe it or not, is a better shot than half the men I've deputized over the years. Then there's Tom Pritchard from the livery, young but steady, and Clayton Morris, the blacksmith. All 3 have reasons to want the Driscolls gone. Cole and his brothers have been causing trouble in town, running up debts, making threats. Silas nodded. What about the bank? They'll want their money back. Bank president is Arthur Lansing. He's old now, but he was here when the robbery happened. Lost his brother in the shooting, one of the guards the McAllister gang killed. Calloway's expression was grim. I'll send word to him. He'll want to be part of this, even if it's just standing as witness. They spent the next 2 hours planning. Calloway sketched out the approach routes, the timing, the signals they'd use. It reminded Silas of planning a military operation, the careful consideration of terrain and tactics. His mind, rusty from years of disuse, began to sharpen. He found himself suggesting modifications, pointing out weaknesses in the plan, offering alternatives based on his experience. You really were military, Calloway said at one point, a note of respect in his voice. Long time ago, Silas said. Different life. The skills don't fade. Not really. Calloway rolled up the map. I'll gather the men. We meet at the old sawmill at 11. That gives us an hour to get into position before noon. Silas left the sheriff's office and walked through Crescent Ridge with Rust at his side. The town looked different now. Before, it had been a place he passed through, a collection of strangers who wanted nothing to do with him. Now it felt like something worth protecting. These people, Ezra with his quiet kindness, young Tom with his curious eyes, even stern Sheriff Calloway, they were decent folk trying to live honest lives. The Driscolls were a poison in the water, and Silas was about to help remove them. He stopped at the general store. Ezra was behind the counter organizing inventory. Heard you went to see the sheriff, Ezra said without preamble. News travels fast. It does. Ezra set down the crate he'd been holding. Also heard he deputized you. And that you're planning to face down the Driscolls at noon. That's the plan. Ezra studied him for a long moment. I'll be there. Calloway will ask me, and I'll say yes. Just wanted you to know. You don't have to do this, Silas said. It's not your fight, isn't it? Ezra's voice was quiet but firm. Those men came into my store yesterday. Bought ammunition and whiskey, laughed about how they were going to persuade the old hermit to share his treasure. Made it clear they didn't plan to leave witnesses. That makes it my fight, Silas, because if they succeed with you, who's to say I'm not next? Or Tom, or anyone else they decide is in their way. Silas felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent so long thinking of himself as alone, as separate from the world, that he'd forgotten what it meant to be part of something larger. A community, a group of people who looked out for each other. Thank you, he said simply. Ezra nodded. Now you'll need supplies. Can't face down outlaws on an empty stomach. He began gathering items. Jerky, hardtack, a canteen. On the house. Consider it an investment in keeping our town safe. Silas took the supplies, feeling the weight of obligation and gratitude in equal measure. He wasn't used to people helping him, wasn't sure how to accept it gracefully. So he just nodded and left. He spent the rest of the morning at the edge of town, checking his revolver, cleaning it, making sure everything worked smoothly. The weapon was old like him, but well-maintained. He'd carried it through the war, kept it oiled and functional even when everything else in his life fell apart. It had been a long time since he'd pointed it at another human being, but the memory was still there, buried under layers of time and regret. Rust sat beside him, sensing the tension. The dog had been through enough with Silas to understand when danger was coming. His ears were up, alert, his body ready. "It'll be all right, boy," Silas said, scratching behind Rust's ears. "One way or another, it'll be over soon." At 11, Silas made his way to the old sawmill. It was abandoned now, the equipment rusted and the building slowly collapsing. But it was private, hidden from the main road, perfect for a gathering that needed to stay quiet. Calloway was already there with 3 other men. Ezra Finch looked calm and ready, a rifle held comfortably in his hands. Tom Pritchard was younger, nervous energy making him shift from foot to foot, but his jaw was set with determination. Clayton Morris, the blacksmith, was a broad man with arms like tree trunks and a face that suggested he'd seen his share of trouble. "This is everyone," Calloway said. "Silas, you've met Ezra. This is Tom and Clayton." The men nodded to Silas. There was no judgment in their eyes, no suspicion, just solidarity. They were here for the same reason he was, because it was right. "Here's how this works," Calloway said, unrolling his map. "Silas will approach from the main trail at noon, just like the Driscolls expect. He'll be carrying a decoy box, similar size and weight to the strong box, but filled with rocks. The real gold stays locked in my office. They'll check the box," Clayton rumbled. His voice was deep, like stones grinding together. "They will," Calloway agreed. "Which is why Silas will carry his sidearm openly and make it clear he's not planning to cooperate easily. The goal is to keep them talking long enough for us to get into position. Ezra, you'll be on the ridge to the west with a clear shot. Tom, you're on the east side, closer to the water. Clayton, you're with me, coming up from behind once they're focused on Silas. What's the signal?" Tom asked. "Silas will say, 'I reckon we're done talking.' That's when we move in." Calloway looked at each of them in turn. "These men are dangerous. They've killed before, won't hesitate to kill again. Do not give them a chance to draw. If they reach for their weapons, you shoot. Understood?" The men nodded, their faces grim. Calloway turned to Silas. "You'll be the most exposed. If things go wrong, hit the ground and let us handle it." "I can hold my own," Silas said. "I don't doubt it. But you're the bait here, not the trap. Let the trap do its work." Silas accepted this. It made tactical sense, even if his pride bristled at the idea of being protected. They synchronized their watches, or in most cases, checked the sun's position, and headed out. Silas took the main trail toward the north shore of Junk Lake, carrying the decoy box and feeling the weight of the deputy's badge on his chest. Behind him, unseen, 4 men moved through the woods to take their positions. The clearing came into view just before noon. It was exactly as Calloway had described, open ground with sparse trees, the lake visible through the branches. And waiting in the center were 3 men. Cole Driscoll stood with his arms crossed, his brothers flanking him. They looked confident, relaxed. They thought this was going to be easy. Silas walked into the clearing. His limp pronounced the box under one arm. Russ stayed back at the tree line, hidden but watchful. "Mr. Boone," Cole called out, his voice friendly. "Glad you could make it. Was starting to think you might have lost your nerve." "My nerve's just fine," Silas said. He set the box down at his feet but didn't open it. "You boys want to tell me why I should give you anything?" Cole's smile faded slightly. "Because we asked nice. And because the alternative is considerably less pleasant. See, that's where we have a problem," Silas said. His hand rested near his revolver, casual but ready. "I spent too many years letting people push me around, letting life push me around. I'm thinking maybe I'm done with that." The 3 Driscoll brothers tensed. Their hands moved closer to their weapons. "You're making a mistake, old man," Frank said. "Maybe," Silas agreed. "But it'll be my mistake to make. And I reckon we're done talking." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then everything happened at once. The first shot came from Ezra's position on the ridge. It kicked up dirt 2 feet in front of Cole Driscoll, a clear warning shot that said, "We have you surrounded." The Driscolls froze, their hands halfway to their weapons. Their eyes darted to the tree line, trying to locate the shooter. That moment of hesitation was all Calloway needed. "Drop your weapons." The sheriff's voice boomed from behind them. "You're surrounded and outgunned. Drop them now." Cole's face went from confident to furious in an instant. He'd been outmaneuvered, and he knew it. But instead of surrendering, his hand completed its movement toward his pistol. "Don't!" Silas shouted, his own revolver already drawn and leveled. "It's over, Cole. Don't make this worse." For a long moment the clearing held its breath. 5 men with weapons drawn, all waiting to see who would break first. Silas could see the calculation in Cole's eyes, weighing his chances, considering his options. Frank and Little Pete looked to their brother, waiting for his lead. Their hands trembled near their guns, fear and adrenaline, making them dangerous and unpredictable. "You set us up," Cole said to Silas, his voice tight with rage. "That badge on your chest, you're working with the law." "I am the law," Silas said calmly. "Temporary deputy duly sworn. And I'm telling you for the last time, drop your weapons." Clayton Morris emerged from the trees behind the Driscolls, his rifle pointed at their backs. Tom Pritchard appeared from the other side, completing the circle. The 3 brothers were trapped. Cole's shoulders sagged. The fight went out of him as reality set in. He raised his hand slowly, carefully, and let his pistol fall to the ground. "All right, we're done." Frank and Little Pete followed suit, their weapons hitting the dirt with dull thuds. Calloway moved in quickly, professional and efficient. He kicked the weapons away and produced iron shackles from his coat. Within minutes, all 3 Driscoll brothers were cuffed and secured. "You're under arrest for attempted robbery, arson and threatening a peace officer," Calloway said. Cole spat on the ground, but said nothing. The fury in his eyes promised violence, but his hands were bound now. Ezra climbed down from his perch, his rifle still ready. Tom and Clayton kept their weapons trained on the prisoners, as Calloway began marching them back toward town. Silas picked up the decoy box and fell into step beside the sheriff. His knee was throbbing, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving pain in its wake. But underneath the pain was something else, satisfaction. He'd stood his ground and won. Rust emerged from the trees and trotted alongside, his tail wagging slightly. The walk back to Crescent Ridge took 30 minutes. Word had spread, and people lined the street to watch as the Driscolls were paraded through town in chains. Some folks called out insults. Others watched in silence, relief evident on their faces. Calloway locked the brothers in the town's small jail. "That's the end of them," he said. "Judge will be through next week, and they'll be tried and sentenced." Silas unpinned the deputy's badge and held it out. "Guess my service is done." Calloway looked at the badge, then at Silas. "Keep it. At least until the trial. You'll need to testify, and having the badge makes it official." Silas pinned it back to his shirt, feeling its weight settle over his heart again. They walked to the bank together. Arthur Lansing, the bank president, was a white-haired man in his 70s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Sheriff," he said, "I heard about the arrests." "Well done. Credit goes to Mr. Boone here," Calloway said. "He found the stolen money and brought it in, instead of keeping it for himself." Lansing's eyes moved to Silas. "The McAllister heist money. 22 years I've waited to see that money returned. My brother died protecting it. I'm sorry for your loss," Silas said quietly. Lansing nodded. "The reward still stands. $500 for the return of the stolen funds. I'll have the paperwork drawn up today. $500. It was more money than Silas had seen in years. Enough to start over somewhere, to build a life that wasn't about running and hiding. "There's something else," Lansing said. He opened a drawer and pulled out a leather journal, old and worn. "When we inventoried the stolen money, we found this. It belonged to James McAllister. His journal from the time of the robbery. I thought you might want to read it, to understand what you've recovered." Silas took the journal carefully. The leather was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed. He opened it to a random entry, dated August 1873. "Buried the money north of the lake, near the old dock. Cole and the boys wanted to split it immediate, but I convinced them to wait. Too much heat right now. We'll come back in 6 months when things cool down. Nobody will think to look at Junk Lake." Silas turned more pages. The entries became shorter, more desperate. McAllister had been wounded in the robbery, gut shot. He died 3 weeks later, somewhere in the Colorado Territory, never making it back to recover the money he'd hidden. His accomplices had scattered, and the secret had died with him, until Rust had dug it up 22 years later. "Keep it," Lansing said. "It's part of the story now. Your story." Silas closed the journal and tucked it under his arm. "Thank you." Outside, the afternoon sun was warm on his face. Silas stood on the sidewalk, Rust beside him, and realized he had a decision to make. He had money coming, enough to leave, to start fresh somewhere new. But he also had something he hadn't had in 15 years, a reason to stay. Crescent Ridge wasn't his town, not really. But the people here had stood with him. Ezra had risked his life. Tom and Clayton had faced down armed criminals. Calloway had trusted him with a badge. These were good people, the kind worth knowing, and Junk Lake had given him back something he'd thought was lost forever. Purpose, dignity, a sense that he mattered. He walked to the general store. Ezra was restocking shelves, humming quietly. "Ezra," Silas said, "that credit you extended me, I'll be able to pay it off tomorrow, plus interest." Ezra turned, surprised. "The bank reward?" $500, more than enough to settle my debts." Silas paused. "I was wondering, you know anyone selling land around here?" "Nothing fancy, just a place to build something permanent." Ezra's face broke into a slow smile. "As a matter of fact, I do. Old Henderson Place, about 2 miles from the lake. 10 acres, mostly wooded, but there's a good clearing for a cabin. Stream runs through it. How much?" "She's asking 200. But I think she'd take 150 if the buyer was serious and had cash." Silas nodded slowly. $150 for land. That would leave him $350 for building materials, tools, supplies. "It was enough. Tell her I'm interested," he said. "Tell her I'll pay cash." Ezra's smile widened. "You're staying then?" "Building a life here. Seems like it's time," Silas said. "I've been running for 15 years. Maybe it's time to stand still and see what grows." That evening, Silas made camp again at Junk Lake, but this time it felt different. The burned shanty stood as a reminder of the violence that had passed, but it no longer looked like defeat. It looked like something that could be cleaned up and rebuilt. A scar, not a wound. He sat by his fire with Rust curled beside him and opened McAllister's journal again. He read through the entries, following the arc of a man's life as it spiraled toward destruction. McAllister had been desperate, angry, convinced the world owed him something. He'd stolen to get what he thought he deserved, and it had cost him everything. Silas thought about his own life, the years of bitterness and isolation, the belief that he was owed peace and had been cheated out of it. How close he'd come to becoming like McAllister, a man so focused on what he'd lost that he couldn't see what he still had. But finding that gold had changed him, not because of the money itself, but because of what came after. The decision to do the right thing, The choice to stand and fight. The realization that he wasn't alone unless he chose to be. He closed the journal and set it aside. Tomorrow he'd collect his reward. The day after, he'd start building. Not just a cabin, but a life. Something Martha would have been proud of. Something that honored the man he'd once been and could be again. Russ lifted his head and looked at Silas with those old knowing eyes. "We did good, boy," Silas said softly. "We did real good." The dog's tail thumped twice against the ground in agreement. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and for the first time in years, Silas Boone felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity that felt purposeful in a way Silas hadn't experienced in years. He collected his reward money from the bank, paid off his debts to Ezra, and purchased the Henderson property for $150 cash. The deed was transferred, witnessed, and recorded. For the first time since Martha died, Silas owned something, a piece of ground that was his alone. The land was everything Ezra had promised. 10 acres of mixed timber with a clearing large enough for a cabin and a garden. A creek ran through the eastern edge, cold and clear, fed by mountain snowmelt. The soil was rocky but workable. It was a good place, a healing place. Silas spent his days clearing the building site, cutting timber and hauling stones for a foundation. His knee complained with every load, every swing of the axe. But the pain felt different now, not pointless suffering, but the honest ache of meaningful work. Tom Pritchard came out on his second day, bringing a wagon load of milled lumber. "Heard you were building," he said. "Thought you could use some proper planks. My father owns the mill. He says any friend of Sheriff Calloway's gets the neighbor rate." Clayton Morris showed up the following week with iron hinges, nails, and a new axe. "Can't build a proper cabin without proper hardware," he said. He stayed for 3 days, helping to raise the frame and set the roof beams. His blacksmith's hands knew wood as well as metal. Ezra provided supplies on credit, glass for windows, tar paper for the roof, a cast-iron stove. "Pay when you can," he said. "You're part of the community now. We look after our own, part of the community." The words settled into Silas like seeds finding soil. He'd been alone so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere. Sheriff Calloway stopped by regularly, sometimes to help with construction, sometimes just to talk. They spoke of small things, weather, local news, the upcoming trial. But underneath was a growing friendship built on shared experience. "You know," Calloway said one evening, "I could use a permanent deputy. Tom's eager but green, and Clayton has his smithy. You've got the temperament for it. The experience." Silas paused in his work. "I'm 52 with a bad knee. Not ideal for chasing outlaws. Most law work isn't chasing outlaws. It's keeping the peace, settling disputes, being a presence." Calloway leaned back. "You've got perspective. You've seen enough to know what's worth fighting over. That's valuable." "I'll think about it," Silas said. The idea took root. He'd worn the badge for less than a day, but it had felt right. The cabin took shape slowly. 4 walls of solid timber, a peaked roof, shingled with split cedar, 2 windows facing south. Inside he built a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, shelves for his few possessions. It was simple, functional, and entirely his. He set Martha's photograph on the mantel, the only picture he had of her, taken on their wedding day. She looked young and alive, her eyes bright with hope. For years, he'd kept it wrapped in oilcloth, unable to look at it without feeling loss. Now he placed it where he could see it every day, a reminder not of what he'd lost, but of what he'd once had. On the 4th week, as he was finishing the porch, a rider approached. Arthur Lansing's clerk, a nervous young man named Wesley. "Mr. Boone," Wesley called out. "Mr. Lansing sent me. There's been a development about the McAllister money." Silas set down his hammer. "What kind of development?" "A woman came to the bank yesterday. Says she's Sarah McAllister, James McAllister's widow. Claims she has a legal right to the recovered money. She's got marriage papers properly witnessed. She's arguing that as his widow she has a claim to any reward. She wants half of your $500. Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Half? Yes, sir. There's a hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10. Silas thanked Wesley and sent him on his way. Then he stood on his unfinished porch and felt the past reaching out to drag him backward. That evening, he opened McAllister's journal, searching for any mention of a wife. He found several entries from early 1873. Sarah's been after me again about settling down, getting legitimate work. She doesn't understand. A man can't make a living on honest wages. This job will set us up for life. Later entries were darker. Sarah left, took what little we had and went back to her family in Kansas. Says she can't be married to an outlaw. Says I've chosen money over her. The final mention was brief. Got word Sarah filed for divorce. Good riddance. But if the divorce hadn't been finalized before McAllister died, was she still legally his widow? And did that give her claim to money connected to his crimes? Silas closed the journal. He'd thought this was over. But the past never stayed buried. The next morning, he dressed in his cleanest shirt, pinned the deputy's badge to his chest, and rode into Crescent Ridge. The hearing was being held in the town hall. Inside, the room was already full. News had spread, and the townspeople had come to watch. They lined the walls, filled the benches. Sarah McAllister sat at a table near the front. She was in her mid-40s, thin and severe, with dark hair pulled back tight. Her dress was plain but clean, her hands folded precisely. She looked like someone who'd had a hard life and learned to survive through stubbornness. Arthur Lansing sat opposite her. Sheriff Calloway stood near the back. Ezra was there, and Tom and Clayton. The people who'd helped Silas build his cabin had come to stand with him. Judge Harold Wickham presided, a heavy-set man in his 60s with shrewd eyes. He banged his gavel once. This is a hearing to determine the rightful recipient of the reward money paid for the return of funds stolen in the 1873 McAllister bank robbery, he announced. Mrs. Sarah McAllister has filed a claim for half the reward. We'll hear from both parties. Mrs. McAllister, you may begin. Sarah stood, her spine straight. Your Honor, I was married to James McAllister in 1871. We were together for 2 years before he turned to crime. I left him when I learned what he'd done, filed for divorce, but he died before the papers were finalized. That makes me his legal widow under territorial law. While I don't claim ownership of stolen money, I believe I'm entitled to a portion of any reward paid for its recovery. Mr. Boone found the money by chance. I lived with the shame of my husband's crimes for 22 years. I believe I've earned something for that suffering. She sat down, her expression unreadable. Judge Wickham turned to Silas. Mr. Boone, your response. Silas stood slowly. Your Honor, I don't doubt Mrs. McAllister suffered. Being married to an outlaw can't be easy. But I didn't find that money by chance. I found it because I was living in a place nobody else wanted, doing work nobody else would do. I found it, and I could have kept it or run with it. Instead, I brought it to the law. I faced down the men who tried to take it from me. I earned that reward through honest choice and honest risk, he paused. Mrs. McAllister filed for divorce. She chose to leave her husband to separate herself from his crimes. That was the right choice. But she can't have it both ways. She can't claim she's not responsible for his actions, while also claiming she deserves compensation connected to those same actions. That money represents closure for the bank, justice for the victims, and payment for my choice to do right when I could have done wrong. Silas sat down. The room was silent. Judge Wickham reviewed the papers, his face thoughtful. Finally, he looked up. This is a complex matter. Mrs. McAllister's suffering is real, but Mr. Boone is correct. She chose to separate herself from her husband's criminal life. She can't now claim benefit from those same crimes. The reward was paid for the return of the money, not for suffering caused by the crime. Mr. Boone performed the service the reward was meant to compensate. My ruling is that the reward belongs entirely to Mr. Boone. The gavel banged once. Final, Sarah McAllister stood and left without a word, her face showing neither disappointment nor relief, just tired acceptance. Outside the town hall, Ezra clapped Silas on the shoulder. Well done. You spoke well in there. Just spoke the truth, Silas said. Truth's enough, Calloway said. Most times that's all a man needs. Silas rode back to his land, feeling lighter. The challenge had been met and overcome. His reward was secure, his future clear. That evening he sat on his unfinished porch with Rust beside him and looked at Martha's photograph through the open door. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, and Silas thought about second chances, how rare they were, how precious, and how they had to be earned through choice and courage. He'd been given his second chance. Now it was up to him to make it count. The trial of the Driscoll brothers took place on a cold morning in late October. Judge Wickham presided again, this time over a packed courtroom filled with witnesses, spectators, and 3 men in chains who'd spent the past month behind bars. The evidence was overwhelming. Silas testified about the threats, the burned shanty, the midnight intimidation. Ezra described the Driscolls' behavior in town. Tom and Clayton corroborated the confrontation at the lake. The carved message, "Share or burn," was entered as evidence, the chardboard displayed for all to see. The Driscoll brothers showed no remorse. Cole sat with his arms crossed, glaring. Frank and little Pete whispered to each other, occasionally laughing. They seemed to think this was all temporary. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts, Judge Wickham sentenced them to 10 years hard labor in the territorial prison. The gavel came down, and the Driscoll brothers were led away in chains, shouting threats that echoed until the doors closed. "That's done," Calloway said afterward, standing with Silas outside the courthouse. "They'll serve their time." Silas nodded, feeling closure. The men who'd threatened him were gone. His reward money was secure. His cabin was nearly finished. Everything was falling into place. "I've been thinking about your offer," Silas said. "The deputy position. I'd like to accept it," Calloway smiled. "I'm glad. The town needs men like you, Silas." They shook hands on it. Silas Boone, who'd spent 15 years running from his past, was now a permanent deputy in Crescent Ridge. It felt like coming home. 2 days later, everything changed. Silas was at his cabin, installing the final window, when he heard horses approaching. Multiple riders moving fast. He set down his tools and reached for his revolver, but the men who emerged weren't outlaws. They were lawmen, 3 U.S. Marshals in dark coats with badges gleaming. Behind them rode Sheriff Calloway, his face grave. The lead marshal was a tall man with iron-gray hair and a scar across his left cheek. He dismounted with practiced ease. "Silas Boone," he said. "That's me." Silas's hand stayed near his weapon. "What's this about?" "I'm Marshal Thomas Garrett. These are my deputies, Cooper and Wade." He gestured to the other 2 men. "We need to talk about the McAllister money. Specifically about what else was in that strongbox." Silas felt ice water run through his veins. "There wasn't anything else. Just the gold, some old bills, and the paper from the bank." "That's what the bank reported," Garrett agreed. "But we've received information suggesting otherwise. May we see inside your cabin?" "You got a warrant?" Garrett produced a folded document, signed by a federal judge. "We have authority to search your property for stolen government bonds that may have been part of the McAllister heist." Government bonds. Silas's mind raced. He'd inventoried the strongbox carefully before taking it to Calloway. There had been gold, old currency, and the bank's paper. "Nothing else. Search all you want," Silas said. "You won't find any bonds, because there weren't any." The marshals spread out, searching the cabin systematically. They checked under the floorboards, examined the fireplace, looked through Silas's belongings. They were thorough and professional. While they searched, Calloway pulled Silas aside. "I'm sorry about this. They showed up this morning with the warrant. Said they had credible information that the strongbox contained bearer bonds stolen from a government shipment." "I didn't take any bonds," Silas said. "I gave you everything that was in that box." "I know. I was there when we inventoried it. But someone's made an accusation." Marshal Garrett emerged from the cabin, his expression unreadable. "Nothing here. But we'll need you to come into town, Mr. Boone. We have more questions." They rode to Crescent Ridge together, Silas feeling like a prisoner despite not being in chains. The townspeople watched as the procession passed, their faces confused and concerned. At the sheriff's office, Marshal Garrett laid out the situation. 3 days ago, a man named Vincent Shaw came forward. He claims he was part of the original McAllister gang, fled after the robbery. He says the strongbox didn't just contain bank money, it also held $50,000 in bearer bonds stolen from a federal courier. Those bonds are negotiable by anyone who holds them. If they've been cashed or hidden, that's a federal offense. I never saw any bonds, Silas said firmly. The box had gold coins, old currency, and a paper from the bank. That's all. Shaw says differently. He says McAllister showed him the bonds before they buried the box. Says they were wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom, beneath the gold. Silas thought back to that morning. He'd removed the oilcloth-wrapped gold, the old bills, the bank's paper. Had there been something else he'd missed? If there were bonds, I didn't see them, Silas said, and I didn't take them. Shaw claims you must have. Says there's no other explanation. Garrett leaned forward. Mr. Boone, if you took those bonds thinking they were just more treasure, now's the time to come clean. Federal courts can be lenient with cooperation. But if we find you've been lying, you're looking at 20 years in federal prison. The room went silent. Silas felt the weight of accusation pressing down. He'd done everything right, found the money, turned it in, faced down criminals. And now he was being accused of theft by a man he'd never met. I want to see this Vincent Shaw, Silas said. I want to hear him make these accusations to my face. Garrett nodded. That can be arranged. He's being held in protective custody in Carson City. We can transport you there for a confrontation. But I'll warn you, he's very convincing. He has details about the robbery that only someone who was there would know. Then take me to him, Silas said. Because either he's lying or something else is going on. But I didn't take any government bonds. Calloway spoke up. Marshal, I've known Silas for weeks now. He's an honest man. If he says he didn't see any bonds, I believe him. Your faith is noted, Sheriff. But we deal in evidence, not faith. Garrett stood. We'll leave for Carson City tomorrow morning. Mr. Boone, you're not under arrest, but you're not to leave town. Understood? Understood, Silas said. That night Silas sat in his cabin with Rust and tried to make sense of what was happening. Someone was accusing him of stealing government bonds he'd never seen. A man named Vincent Shaw had come forward after 22 years with a story that put Silas in the crosshairs. Why now? Why after all this time? Silas pulled out McAllister's journal and read through it again. Looking for any mention of bonds or of a man named Vincent Shaw, he found one entry, dated August 10th, 1873. Shaw's getting nervous. Keeps talking about splitting up, going our separate ways before the law catches up. I told him to hold steady. Once we bury the money and the papers, we wait 6 months. Nobody looks for treasure at Junk Lake. Vincent needs to trust me. The papers. McAllister had mentioned papers, not bonds specifically. But papers could mean bonds. Silas kept reading. Another entry, August 12th. Had to cut Vincent out. He was going to talk, I could see it in his eyes. Told him we changed the burial spot, that we're heading north instead of west. He believed me. By the time he figures out he's been cheated, we'll be long gone. Sorry, Vincent. Nothing personal. Silas sat back, understanding dawning. McAllister had double-crossed Shaw, told him one thing, done another. Shaw probably spent years searching in the wrong places, never finding the money because McAllister had lied about where it was buried, and now, 22 years later, Shaw learns that the money's been found. And Shaw sees an opportunity, claim there were bonds in the box, bonds that Silas must have taken. Either force Silas to produce bonds that don't exist, or discredit him and maybe leverage some kind of reward for coming forward. It was a con, a long-delayed revenge and money grab by a bitter man who'd been cheated out of his share 2 decades ago. But proving it would be another matter entirely. Silas looked at Rust, who was watching him with patient eyes. We're in trouble, boy, he said quietly. The kind that doesn't sort itself out easy. The dog whined softly and rested his head on Silas's knee. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The home he'd finally created was now at risk. His freedom, his reputation, his entire future hung on proving his innocence against accusations from a ghost of the past. Tomorrow, he'd go to Carson City. Tomorrow, he'd face Vincent Shaw and hear the lies spoken directly. And somehow he'd have to find a way to prove that what he'd said from the beginning was true. He'd found the money, and he'd turned in everything that was there, even if that truth was harder to believe than the lie. The journey to Carson City took 2 days. Silas rode alongside the 3 marshals, watching the landscape change from forest to high desert. The nights were cold, the days long. Marshal Garrett was professional but distant, treating Silas with the careful neutrality reserved for men who might be criminals. Silas used the time to think, to plan. He had McAllister's journal with him. Garrett had allowed it as potential evidence. Those 2 entries about Shaw were crucial. They proved McAllister had lied to Shaw, had cut him out of the robbery proceeds. But would they be enough to prove Shaw was lying now about the bonds? On the second evening, camped under a sky full of stars, Marshal Cooper approached the fire where Silas sat. "Mind if I sit?" Cooper was younger than Garrett, maybe 35, with an open face that suggested he hadn't yet developed the hard cynicism that came with years of law work. "Free country," Silas said. Cooper settled down, poured himself coffee from the pot. "Garrett's a good man, fair, but he's also cautious. He won't make assumptions either way about your guilt or innocence." "I'd expect nothing less," Silas said. "The thing is," Cooper continued, his voice low enough that Garrett and Wade couldn't hear from their positions across camp, "I've been doing some thinking. Shaw's story's detailed, convincing, but it's also convenient. He comes forward right after the money's recovered, claims there were bonds nobody else saw, and puts you on the hook for them. If you're guilty, you go to prison. If you're innocent but can't prove it, you still might go to prison. Either way, Shaw looks like a cooperating witness who might get clemency for old crimes." Silas looked at the younger marshal with new interest. "You think he's lying?" "I think it's possible. I think it's worth investigating more than just you." Cooper took a sip of his coffee. "But I'm not the lead on this case. Garrett is. And he's focused on you because you're the one who had access to the strongbox. What would you do?" Silas asked. "If you were investigating, I'd want to know more about Shaw, where he's been for 22 years, how he's been living, whether he's got any reason beyond old grievances to make these claims." Cooper stood. "But that's just me, and I'm not in charge." He walked back to his bedroll, leaving Silas with his thoughts. They arrived in Carson City mid-morning on the 3rd day. The federal marshal's office was a sturdy brick building near the territorial courthouse. Inside, Marshal Garrett led Silas through a maze of corridors to a room with a table and several chairs. A barred window looked out on an alley. "Wait here," Garrett said. "I'll bring Shaw in. You'll have a chance to confront him directly, hear his accusations and respond. But I warn you, no violence, no threats. This is a legal proceeding, not a saloon brawl." "Understood," Silas said. Garrett left. Silas sat at the table and tried to calm his breathing. Everything depended on the next hour. He had the journal entries, he had his own testimony, and he had the truth. It would have to be enough. The door opened. Marshal Garrett entered first, followed by another marshal Silas didn't recognize. And then came Vincent Shaw. He was a small man, late 50s, with thinning hair and a face weathered by hard living. His clothes were clean but worn, his hands rough from manual labor. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent time in jail and learned to be cautious. When he saw Silas, his eyes narrowed. "That's him," Shaw said. "That's the man who found the strongbox." They sat across from each other, the table between them like a battle line. Garrett took a position at the head of the table, a notepad in front of him. "Mr. Shaw," Garrett said, "please repeat your allegations for Mr. Boone's benefit." Shaw leaned forward, his voice steady. "I was part of James McAllister's gang in 1873. We robbed the First National Bank in Crescent Ridge and a federal courier carrying bearer bonds. Total take was around $2 million in gold and $50,000 in negotiable bonds. We buried everything in a strongbox near Junk Lake. The plan was to wait 6 months, let things cool down, then retrieve it and split the take. But that didn't happen," Garrett prompted. "No, James cut me out. Told me we'd changed the burial location, sent me searching in the wrong places. By the time I figured out I'd been betrayed, he was dead and the money was lost. I spent years looking, never found it. Eventually gave up, tried to go straight. Shaw's eyes fixed on Silas. Then I hear the money's been recovered. This man here found it, turned it into the bank. But when I heard what was recovered, the bonds weren't listed. Just gold and old currency. Those bonds were in that box? I know because I helped pack them. If this man turned in the gold but kept the bonds, that's $50,000 in federal theft. Silas met Shaw's gaze without flinching. I never saw any bonds. The box had gold, old bills, and a paper from the bank identifying it as stolen property. That's all. He's lying, Shaw said flatly. Those bonds were at the bottom of the box, wrapped in separate oilcloth. Beneath the gold. I opened the box, Silas said. I removed everything. There were no bonds. Then where are they? Shaw demanded. They didn't just disappear. Silas pulled McAllister's journal from his coat and set it on the table. This belonged to James McAllister. It was recovered with the money. There are entries in here about you, Mr. Shaw, specifically about how McAllister cut you out of the robbery. Shaw's face tightened. What entries? Silas opened to the marked pages and read aloud. The entry about Shaw getting nervous, about needing to trust McAllister. Then the second entry, the one about cutting Shaw out, lying to him about the burial location. When Silas finished, Shaw was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "That doesn't prove anything except what I already told you, that James betrayed me." "It proves he lied to you," Silas said. "Which raises a question. If he lied to you about where the money was buried, what else did he lie about? Maybe he lied about the bonds being in the box at all." "I saw them," Shaw insisted. "I was there when we packed the strongbox." "The bonds were real." "Maybe they were real," Silas agreed. "But maybe McAllister cashed them before he died, or buried them somewhere else, or lost them." "You didn't see him bury the strongbox, did you?" Shaw hesitated. "No, he did that alone. Said it was safer if only he knew the exact location. So you never actually saw the bonds go into the ground?" Silas pressed. "You saw them at some point during the robbery, but you have no direct knowledge that they were in the strongbox when it was buried at Junk Lake." "I know they were supposed to be there," Shaw said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Silas turned to Marshal Garrett. "He's guessing. He's assuming the bonds were in the box because that was the plan. But McAllister was a liar and a betrayer. His own journal proves it. Shaw has no proof the bonds were ever buried. He's making accusations based on assumptions and old grievances." Garrett looked at Shaw. "Is that true? You didn't actually witness the bonds being placed in the strongbox at the burial site?" Shaw's jaw worked. "No, but James said." "James lied to you about everything else," Garrett interrupted. "Why would you believe him about this?" Shaw slumped slightly. The confidence he'd shown earlier was cracking. "I spent 22 years thinking about that money, thinking about what was taken from me. When I heard it had been found, I thought finally, I could get something back. The bonds were supposed to be there. They had to be there, but they weren't," Silas said quietly. "And you can't prove they were. You're accusing me of theft based on what you wanted to be true, not what actually was true." The room fell silent. Garrett made notes, his pen scratching across paper. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Shaw, your testimony is compelling, but it's based on second-hand information from a man who demonstrably lied to you. Without physical evidence that the bonds were in the strongbox, without witnesses who saw them being buried, I can't bring charges against Mr. Boone. There's simply no case." Shaw's face went red. "You're just going to let him walk? He has those bonds somewhere." "I have nothing," Silas said, "because there was nothing to take." "This isn't over," Shaw said, his voice shaking with rage. "I'll find proof. I'll prove you're lying." "You can try," Garrett said. "But until you do, this matter is closed. Mr. Boone, you're free to go." "Thank you for your cooperation." Silas stood, his legs unsteady. He'd won. The accusation had been investigated and dismissed. He was cleared. But as he left the room, passing by Shaw's hunched, defeated figure, he felt no triumph. Only sadness for a man who'd spent 2 decades chasing a lie told by a dead outlaw, and who'd nearly destroyed an innocent man trying to recover something that had never been his to begin with. Outside, Marshal Cooper was waiting. "Congratulations," he said. "Garrett told me how it went." "You handled yourself well." "Thank you," Silas said. "And thank you for the conversation the other night. It helped me think through what I needed to say." Cooper nodded. "Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about finding the truth and letting it speak for itself." They shook hands. Then Cooper arranged for a horse and supplies for Silas's journey home. By noon, Silas was riding back toward Crescent Ridge. The weight of accusation finally lifted from his shoulders. The ride home took 3 days. Silas used the time to reflect on everything that had happened since Rust dug up that strongbox. The money, the threats, the trial, the accusations. It had been a cascade of challenges, each one testing him in different ways. But he'd faced them all and survived. More than survived. He'd grown. The man riding back to Crescent Ridge wasn't the same broken drifter who'd limped into Junk Lake weeks ago. He was stronger now, more certain of who he was and what he stood for. When he finally crested the ridge overlooking his property, he saw his cabin standing solid and complete. Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone had been keeping the fire going. As he rode closer, he saw Ezra sitting on the porch, a rifle across his knees. "Figured someone should keep an eye on the place," Ezra called out, "in case Shaw had friends who didn't like how things turned out." Silas dismounted, his heart full. "Thank you, Ezra. That's what neighbors do," Ezra said simply. "Welcome home, Silas, home." The word settled into Silas like a benediction. He was home, and this time he was staying. Winter came to Crescent Ridge with the first snow in early November. Silas woke to a world transformed, his cabin roof white, the creek frozen at the edges, the trees heavy with powder that caught the morning light and turned everything golden. He'd been home for 2 weeks, settling back into the rhythm of life. The deputy position was official now, his badge polished and worn with pride. Most days were quiet, mediating disputes between neighbors, checking on elderly residents, making sure the saloon didn't get too rowdy on Saturday nights. It was good work, honest work, and it filled the empty spaces in his life that had been there so long he'd forgotten they existed. Rust loved the snow. The old dog bounded through it like a puppy, barking at nothing, his grey muzzle crusted with ice. Watching him, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years, contentment, but contentment, he was learning, was fragile. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning. Silas was in town making his rounds when a rider came in hard and fast. The man was covered in trail dust, his horse lathered with sweat. He went straight to the sheriff's office. Silas followed, his instincts prickling. Something was wrong. Inside, the rider was talking to Calloway, his words tumbling out in a rush. 3 men, maybe 4. They hit the mining camp at Silver Creek, killed 2 guards, took the payroll. Around 5,000 in cash and gold certificates. They're headed this way using the mountain pass. When? Calloway demanded. Yesterday evening. I rode all night to warn the towns along their route. They're dangerous, Sheriff. Professionals. They knew exactly when the payroll would be there, knew where the guards would be positioned. Calloway looked at Silas. This is what I was afraid of. Word got out about the McAllister money being recovered here. Now every outlaw within 100 miles thinks Crescent Ridge is soft, thinks we're an easy target. We're not, Silas said quietly. No, we're not. Calloway turned to the rider. Get some rest, get your horse fed. You've done your job. He looked back at Silas. We need to organize a defense. If they're using the mountain pass, they'll come through here by tomorrow, maybe sooner if they're pushing hard. They spent the morning gathering men. Tom Pritchard, Clayton Morris, Ezra Finch. A few others, ranchers, shopkeepers, men who knew how to handle weapons and weren't afraid to use them. By noon they had 15 able-bodied defenders. Calloway spread a map across his desk. The pass opens into the valley here, about 3 miles north of town. If we can stop them there, we keep the fight away from homes and families. We set up positions on both sides of the pass, create a crossfire. When they come through, we give them one chance to surrender. If they don't take it, we end it. 3 or 4 men against 15, Clayton rumbled. They'd be fools to fight. They'd be fools to come here at all, Calloway said. But here they are. We prepare for the worst and hope for the best. They rode out that afternoon carrying rifles, ammunition, and supplies for an overnight watch. The temperature was dropping, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more snow. They reached the pass as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the narrow canyon. Calloway positioned the men carefully, 8 on the eastern ridge, 7 on the western, with clear sight lines down the pass. Silas took a position on the eastern side, his rifle loaded, his revolver within easy reach. Rust lay beside him, quiet and alert. Night fell. The cold was brutal, seeping through layers of clothing and settling into bones. The men took turns sleeping, always keeping at least half their number awake and watching. Silas took the first watch, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Around midnight, Ezra joined him. "Can't sleep," he said, settling down beside Silas. "Too cold, too keyed up." "I know the feeling," Silas said. They sat in companionable silence for a while. Then Ezra said, "You think they'll come?" "They'll come. Question is whether they'll be smart enough to surrender. And if they're not?" Silas looked at the older man. "Then we do what needs doing. We protect what's ours." Ezra nodded slowly. "I've never killed a man. Run a store my whole life, never had cause for violence. But if it comes to it, if they threaten this town, these people, I won't hesitate." "Hesitation gets you killed," Silas said. "When the moment comes, you act. You don't think. You don't question. You act." "That's the soldier talking," Ezra observed. "That's the survivor talking," Silas corrected. "The soldier died a long time ago. I'm just a man trying to protect his home." Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to grey to pale blue. The men stirred, checking their weapons, eating cold breakfast. The snow had started again during the night, light flurries that dusted everything white, and then, around mid-morning, Silas spotted them. 4 riders moving carefully through the pass. They were spread out, alert, their hands near their weapons. These weren't amateurs. They moved like men who'd done this before, who knew how to watch for ambushes and how to respond to them. Silas signaled to Calloway on the opposite ridge. The sheriff nodded and raised his hand, ready to give the order. The riders came closer. Silas could make out details now. Their faces hard and weathered, their clothes worn but functional, their horses strong and fresh despite the long ride. They were scanning the ridges, looking for exactly what was waiting for them. When they were in the center of the kill zone, Calloway stood, his rifle aimed, his voice carrying across the pass. "This is Sheriff Wade Calloway of Crescent Ridge. You're surrounded by armed deputies. Throw down your weapons and surrender, or we will fire." The 4 riders froze. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of them, a big man with a thick beard, reached for his rifle. "Don't!" Silas shouted. "Don't make this mistake!" But the big man was already moving, his rifle swinging up toward Calloway's position. The other 3 riders followed his lead, spurring their horses and drawing weapons. "Fire!" Calloway ordered. 15 rifles spoke as one. The sound was deafening, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. The first volley caught the riders in mid-motion. 2 went down immediately, thrown from their horses by the impact. The third managed to get off a shot before a bullet caught him in the shoulder and spun him around. The 4th rider, the big bearded man who'd drawn first, somehow stayed mounted. He charged toward the eastern ridge, toward Silas's position, his rifle blazing. Bullets kicked up snow around the defenders. Someone cried out in pain. Silas aimed carefully, leading the target, compensating for movement and distance. He exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The shot took the rider in the chest. He jerked back, his rifle falling from his hands. His horse kept running for a few more steps before the man toppled sideways and hit the ground hard. Silence descended. Gunsmoke drifted through the pass, mixing with the falling snow. 4 bodies lay still on the frozen ground. "Cease fire," Calloway called. "Cease fire! Check for wounded, ours and theirs." Men scrambled down from the ridges. Silas moved carefully, his rifle still ready. He reached the big bearded man first and checked for a pulse. Nothing. The man's eyes stared at nothing, already glazing over in the cold. One of the defenders had been hit, a rancher named Miller, shot in the leg. It wasn't life-threatening, but he'd need a doctor. Of the 4 outlaws, 3 were dead. The one who'd been shot in the shoulder was still breathing, unconscious, but alive. They loaded the wounded, both Miller and the outlaw, onto horses and headed back to town. The bodies of the 3 dead outlaws were wrapped in canvas and tied to their own horses. It was grim work, done in silence. By the time they reached Crescent Ridge, the news had spread. The townspeople lined the street, their faces showing relief and gratitude. Children pointed at the wrapped bodies. Women clutched their shawls against the cold. Men nodded their approval. Silas felt no pride, no satisfaction, just tired acceptance. This was the cost of peace. Sometimes you had to fight for it. Sometimes men died. It was the way of things, and no amount of wishing made it different. Doc Mercer took charge of Miller and the wounded outlaw. Calloway wrote up his report, documenting everything that had happened. The bodies were taken to the undertaker. That evening, Silas sat in his cabin cleaning his rifle. His hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, rod down the barrel, patch soaked in oil, working out the powder residue. Rust lay by the fire, his presence a comfort. There was a knock at the door. Silas opened it to find Calloway standing there, snow dusting his hat. "Wanted to check on you," the sheriff said. "That was a clean shot today. Probably saved lives. I did what needed doing," Silas said. "I know, but that doesn't make it easy." Calloway came inside, shaking snow from his coat. "The outlaw we brought in alive, his name's Carl Brennan. He's talking, trying to bargain for leniency. Says there were supposed to be 5 of them, not 4. Says the 5th man is still out there, watching the town, waiting for an opportunity." Silas felt ice settle in his stomach. "You believe him?" "I don't know. Could be truth. Could be he's trying to cause trouble, make us waste resources chasing shadows." Calloway looked grim. "But we can't ignore it. If there is a 5th man, he's dangerous. He watched his partners get killed and didn't run. That suggests either discipline or revenge. Maybe both. What do you need me to do?" Silas asked. "Stay alert. Keep your weapon close. Watch for anyone unfamiliar, anyone who doesn't belong." Calloway headed for the door, then paused. "You did good today, Silas, real good. I'm glad you're on our side." After Calloway left, Silas stood at his window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. Somewhere out there, maybe, was a man with murder in his heart and nothing left to lose. The fight wasn't over yet. The 5th man came 3 days later, not with guns blazing, but with fire. Silas woke to Rust's frantic barking and the smell of smoke. He grabbed his revolver and threw open the door. The barn at the edge of town was burning, flames reaching high into the night sky. He ran despite his protesting knee. People were forming bucket lines, but the fire had too much of a head start. The barn was already lost. Calloway pulled him aside. "This wasn't an accident. Someone poured lamp oil around the foundation. We found the cans." "The 5th man," Silas said. "Has to be. The barn belonged to the Pritchard family. They lost 4 horses. Tom had stood with them at the pass. Now his family was paying the price. He'll strike again," Silas said. "We need to make him come to us. Give him a target he can't resist." "What kind of target?" "Me." Silas met the sheriff's eyes. "I killed his partner. I'm who he wants. We make it look easy, and when he comes, we're waiting." They spent the next day preparing. Calloway quietly positioned men in the woods around Silas's cabin. Ezra, Clayton, Tom. They took positions before sunset, hiding themselves carefully. Silas stayed in his cabin, visible through the windows, going through his normal routine. He made dinner, tended his fire, sat reading by lamplight, but his revolver was loaded and within reach. And Rust was outside with Ezra, trained to stay silent. The first night passed without incident. So did the second. By the 3rd night, some questioned whether Brennan had been lying. Silas didn't believe that. He could feel it, the weight of hostile attention. Someone was out there watching. It came on the 4th night, just after midnight. The floorboard on his porch creaked, a board he'd deliberately left loose. His eyes snapped open. He didn't move, just listened. The window shattered. A flaming bottle arced through, trailing fire. It hit the floor and exploded. Flames spread fast. A second bottle came through, then a third. The cabin was filling with smoke and fire. The front door crashed open. A man stood silhouetted, a pistol in each hand. lean and wiry, with wild eyes. "For my brothers," the man snarled, and opened fire. Silas dove behind his overturned table as bullets tore through the wood. He returned fire, forcing the man back. But the cabin was burning. He couldn't stay. He crashed through the back window, rolled in the snow, came up firing. The man was moving around the cabin, trying to flank him. Silas felt something hot tear through his left arm. He'd been hit. "Now!" Silas shouted. "Now!" The woods erupted with gunfire. Ezra's rifle cracked. Clayton's shotgun boomed. Tom's revolver added its voice. The fifth man spun, realizing he'd walked into a trap. He fired wildly, backing toward the trees, but there was nowhere to go. He made it 10 yards before Ezra's shot took him in the leg. He went down hard. Clayton was there instantly, shotgun leveled. "Don't move," Clayton growled. The man stayed down, his face twisted in pain. "You killed them. You killed my brothers." "They killed themselves," Calloway said, emerging from the trees. "They made their choice." Silas walked over, his arm throbbing. The man looked up at him with pure hatred. "You shot Billy, my brother." "I did," Silas said quietly. He was drawing on the sheriff. "He gave me no choice. There's always a choice." "Yes," Silas agreed. "And your brother made his, just like you made yours." They bound the man's hands and treated his leg. His name was Daniel Garrett. He and his 4 brothers had been robbing mining camps for years. As they led Garrett away, Silas turned to look at his cabin. It was fully engulfed, flames consuming everything he'd built. The roof collapsed with a shower of sparks. Ezra came to stand beside him. "I'm sorry, Silas. We'll help you rebuild." "I know you will," Silas said. His arm hurt, his cabin was burning, and he was bone-tired. But he was alive. His friends were alive. The town was safe. "It's just wood and nails." "I can build it again." Doc Mercer arrived and tended to Silas's arm. The bullet had gone clean through. "It would heal, though it would hurt for a while. Where will you stay?" Calloway asked. "I've got a spare room," Ezra offered immediately. "It's yours as long as you need it. The forge has a loft." Clayton added, "My father's got space at the livery," Tom said. Silas looked at these men, these friends, and felt something catch in his throat. A year ago he'd been alone. Now he had people fighting to give him shelter. "Thank you," he said. "All of you. I'll take Ezra up on his offer, just until I can rebuild." "Take your time," Ezra said. "And when you're ready, we'll all be here to help." As dawn broke, Silas sat with his friends and watched the last embers die. The fire had taken his home, but it hadn't taken his hope. He'd build again. And this time, he wouldn't be standing alone. Spring came to Crescent Ridge like a promise kept. The snow melted, revealing ground that had been hidden for months. The creek ran full and fast, swollen with runoff. Birds returned to the trees, filling the mornings with song. And on the land Silas owned, a new cabin rose from the ashes of the old. It took 3 months to rebuild. The foundation was deeper, set on stone that would last 100 years. The walls were thicker, the roof sturdier, the windows positioned to catch both morning and evening light. He built a proper porch, a smokehouse, and a root cellar. He built with the understanding that this wasn't temporary. This was home. He didn't build alone. Every man who'd stood with him came to help. Ezra brought lumber and supplies. Clayton forged hinges and nails. Tom hauled stones for the foundation. Even Sheriff Calloway spent his days off swinging a hammer. The women came too. Widow Hennessy brought meals. The schoolteacher organized the children to clear brush and stack firewood. The whole town had a hand in raising Silas's new home. On a warm April morning, they finished. The last shingle was nailed, the last board planed smooth. The men stepped back and surveyed their work. "It's a good house," Calloway said. "Strong, it'll weather whatever comes." "It will," Silas agreed, "because it was built by good people with honest hands." That evening, Silas sat on his new porch with rust at his feet and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Inside, Martha's photograph hung on the mantel in its place of honor. His rifle rested above the door. Everything was as it should be. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the years of drifting, the weight of loss he'd carried. The morning rust had dug up that corroded strongbox and changed everything. The threats and trials, the accusations and fires. Each challenge had tested him, and each time he'd chosen to stand rather than run, he'd become someone again. Not the young soldier who'd fought at Shiloh, not the grieving husband who'd walked away from life. Someone new, someone forged by loss but not broken by it. Someone who understood that home wasn't a place you found, it was something you built, choice by choice, with the help of people who believed in you. The next morning, Silas rode into town wearing his deputy's badge. He made his rounds, checked on the Pritchards' new barn, stopped by Ezra's store for coffee, talked with folks who greeted him by name now. At the sheriff's office, Calloway had news. Heard from Marshal Garrett. The Driscoll brothers are serving their time in the territorial prison. And Daniel Garrett got 15 years, and Vincent Shaw. Silas asked. Nothing. He disappeared after the hearing. Maybe he gave up on his quest. Maybe he finally accepted that the past is gone. Calloway leaned back. Either way, that chapter's closed. Silas nodded. Closed chapters. That's what the past year had been about. Closing chapters that had been left open too long. Now those stories were done, and new ones were beginning. That afternoon, Silas went to the cemetery on the hill overlooking town. He found a quiet spot beneath an oak tree, a place with a view of the valley and mountains. He stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands, and spoke to Martha in his heart. He told her about the cabin he'd built, about the friends he'd made, about the life he was living. He told her he was sorry it had taken so long to find his way back. He told her he still loved her, still missed her, and always would. But he also told her he was ready to live again, ready to wake up each morning with purpose instead of just surviving, ready to be part of something larger than his own grief. The wind moved through the oak leaves, and Silas chose to hear it as Martha's blessing. He placed wildflowers on the spot where he'd one day rest. Not today, not for many years yet, but someday. Then he walked back down the hill to the town that had become his home. Summer brought heat and growth. Silas tended a garden, growing vegetables he'd trade with neighbors. He broke up fights at the saloon, mediated disputes, helped search for a lost child who was found safe. He did the quiet, necessary work of keeping the peace. One evening in late summer, Silas sat on his porch as the sun set, Rust's head resting on his knee. The old dog's muzzle was grayer now, his movements slower, but his eyes were still bright. "We've come a long way, boy," Silas said softly, scratching behind Rust's ears. "From that forsaken lake to this, from running away to standing still, from being nobody to being somebody who matters." Rust's tail thumped twice against the porch boards. Silas looked out at the land he owned, the town he protected, the life he'd built from ruins and regret. He thought about the corroded strongbox that had started it all, the gold that had tested his character, the challenges that had forged his resolve, the community that had given him purpose. Sometimes a man reaches a point where he's got nothing left to lose except his dignity. Silas had been at that point once, standing on the muddy shore of Junk Lake with his old dog and a heart full of ghosts. He'd been given a choice, to keep running or to stand and fight for something better. He'd made his choice, and that choice had led him here. The past would always be part of him, the war, the loss, the years of wandering. But it didn't define him anymore. He'd written a new story, one choice at a time, a story about redemption and second chances. About finding home not in a place but in purpose. About discovering that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to stand anyway, to build anyway, to hope anyway. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Silas Boone, deputy, friend, survivor, sat in peace on the porch of the home he'd built with his own hands, surrounded by the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. And for the first time in 15 years, that was enough.